Okay, here we are back again. So let's get back to our assignment here. And next up is Kimberlyn. And so you have listed yours as settings 1, 2, and 3. So I'm not quite sure what those mean, but I think you maybe misunderstood the assignment. So why don't you go ahead and read it again and look at the examples in the modules for the assignment. Briefly, the assignment is to shoot the same thing twice with using each of the things that affect depth of field, the aperture, the size of the aperture, the focal length of the lens, and the distance from the subject. So you find 3 different subjects. And for the first one, the only thing you'll change is the aperture. For the second, the only thing you change is the focal length. And for the third, the only thing you'll change is the distance from subject. And you have some very nice images here. I like the lighting in both of these. It's very beautiful. But each set should be of the same subject, 3 different subjects, but within each group, the same subject, with one image showing great depth of field and the second showing shallow depth of field. Okay. Okay, next up, Luis. What a cute dog. Oh my goodness, so cute. So these images are for aperture. Did a really good job on these. The image on the left has an aperture of f4.5. You can see that the depth of field is really pretty shallow. Look at the tufts of hair coming off the ears. So cute. And then with the aperture at f29, a really, really small aperture, you can see the depth of field is really great. And everything from the foreground in front of the dog's nose to the background, the back of the couch, everything is in sharp focus. So great job on these. Distance from subject. So the focal length is at 18 millimeters and the aperture at f3.5. What a sweet kitty, yawning kitty. And here, closer to the cat, the depth of field actually looks relatively great. It's maybe a little shallower than the image made from further back. That's a beautiful expression you caught. So the depth of field actually is not especially shallow in the quote shallow frame. And that's mostly, I would say, because the focal length of the lens is so short. So if you stood back a little more and used maybe 50 millimeters, then you would have shallower depth of field here, but still have great depth of field in this image. Okay, and with the focal length, it didn't really change very much. So from 43 to 55 millimeters is not a huge change. So you have a lens that actually goes to relatively wide angle. So for the great depth of field, that's what I would use, because both of these images are showing shallow depth of field. The image on the right with this somewhat longer focal length, 55 millimeters, has shallower depth of field, but the 43 millimeter image still has pretty shallow depth of field. Okay, but beautiful images. It's such a cutie. Okay, thank you, Luis. Alma. So beautiful, gorgeous, gorgeous image. Both of them with the great depth of field and the shallow depth of field. So you used an Apple iPhone 13, and perhaps you put it in the portrait mode. I'm not sure, but that of course allows you to change the appearance of the image in terms of the depth of field. It says here f1.6, but it says that for both the great depth of field and the shallow depth of field. All right. But lovely image. I see it's at a minus exposure, which is fine. That brings out the exposure of the sky more and throws the foreground into a bit of shadow, which works beautifully. Okay. Distance from subject, I don't think the distance changed here. So the image on the right is out of focus, but the distance, neither the distance nor the focal length of the lens changed here. And that also is true of this set. So the fact, it's essentially, well, it's close to the same image, but it's not the same, but is very close to being the same. And again, it's also too dark really to see a change in the depth of field, but the framing is the same. So the focal length didn't change. Okay, so if you want to redo that, that's up to you. That is great. Okay, thank you, Alma. Okay, Knox. Beautiful images, right? So these are for aperture, and the image on the left using f/36, so very small aperture, and the image on the right using f/5.3, a relatively large aperture. And there's, as you can see, a huge difference in the depth of field. Technically, the depth of field is still shallow with this image here. And that's because the focal length of the lens is so long. And actually the focal length changed a little bit in these, but because the focal length is so long, 127 millimeters is the relative focal length for 35 millimeter photography, you're going to have shallower depth of field. So you could use a shorter lens and come in a little closer, perhaps, and that would give you greater depth of field in this image. This one obviously doesn't need shallower depth of field. It's very shallow and very beautiful. So very nice job on those. Your distance images both work well. It's difficult to see what the depth of field is actually, because everything is a little further away from the lens. But if we come in close here, it looks as if the depth of field is still pretty great. And that has to do with your distance, which is further back from the subject, and the focal length of the lens, which is relatively short, which gives great depth of field. And of course, the depth of field is even greater in this image, where you're even further back and using, well, further back away from the subject. Okay. And the focal length of the lens here, the image on the left, obviously showing very shallow depth of field and using a very long lens. So 450 millimeters is very long, and I assume that means you were really pretty far back away from the subject. And then the image on the right using a focal length of 60 millimeters, so much, much shorter. In the normal range, not the wide angle range, but much, much shorter than 450 millimeters. So here, the depth of field is so shallow, it's probably only about an inch or two in depth, I guess. The depth of field here, much greater. As you can see, it's still a bit shallow. The background is out of focus. So if you wanted to redo it, it's up to you. This still shows much greater depth of field than the previous image. But if you wanted to, you could use an even shorter lens and a smaller aperture. So you're at f6.3 here, which is still pretty large. So you could stop down, you know, to F11 or F16, up the ISO maybe to 800, even 1600, but 800, and you would definitely get even greater depth of field. But these work very nicely, and you did a great job on these knocks. Thank you. Okay, Vrushank, I hope I'm saying that correctly. So you actually have 4 images here, but let us take 2 of them, right? These 2. And look at them, and we can see that the depth of field is very different. Beautiful job on these. So the image, oops, on the left looks as if it's using, yeah, left is f2.8, so really pretty large aperture. And the image on the right, f22, a pretty small aperture. And they're just very different images of the same thing, the same composition. But by changing how much of the frame is in focus, you change really the entire image in this case. So great job on these. Distance from subject. So these were made with a phone, and it's really difficult to see a change in depth of field. It looks to me, excuse me, as if both are showing really quite great depth of field. So the image here on the left with a focal length of 185, which is very long, but an aperture of f2, which is very large. Nevertheless, the depth of field is really great, and that's because everything in the frame is beyond a certain distance. It's pretty far away, and when that's true, the depth of field will be great. So when the subjects are beyond maybe 20 or 30 feet and then out to infinity, the depth of field will appear to be, it will be great, even with the large aperture that you're using here and the long lens. But you can see that the chimney and the houses beyond are both in sharp focus. It's difficult to see the information in the image on the right because it's so dark. So we can come in closer and you know, try and see here what's going on. But if you look at the mountain, the edge is completely sharp, and the clouds are completely sharp, and so is the foreground, the roof here, the chimney, and so on. So both of these are definitely showing great depth of field. And the focal length here actually didn't change. So the focal length is, it says it's 35 millimeters in both. So you changed the distance. So I guess they're just mixed up. So these change the focal length and these change the distance. But it looks as if the depth of field hasn't really changed. So this is coming in closer with the image where you're further back, but the depth of field is pretty great. And the depth of field in this, actually, it's slightly out of focus, which is why the background looks out of focus, but the entire thing is slightly out of focus. So if you want to redo, that's up to you. you know, there is a slight change in the depth of field in these, but not much. The aperture, again, the aperture images are excellent. The distance, both are showing great depth of field. So that's up to you, okay? But very, very nice job on the aperture images. Thank you, Vushang. Okay, finally, I hope I say your name correctly. Is it Kade? Kade? Anyway, let's look at your images. Here are the aperture images. And it looks as if in these, the image, it's the same image, but you have manipulated what's in focus using software. That's what it looks like anyway. The metadata, which you can see if you look at the right-hand portion here, kind of disappears in the second image. And if you look here, you can see part of the spray can is out of focus, but not all of it if you go back and forth. So not quite sure what you did here, but the depth of field on its own doesn't change. And that's, first of all, because none of the settings really change, but also because there's no space really between the shoes and the wall. So there's not enough depth to show depth of field, if that makes sense. Distance from subject will come in a little closer. And in this frame, you can kind of see the background, and it does appear to be sharp, right? It's dark really, so it's difficult to see the background, but it looks as if it's sharp there. But it is really pretty difficult, almost impossible to see background in this image. So we can't really tell that the depth of field has changed. So what you could do is shift the camera over a little bit, one way or the other, so that we can see the background. So in this image, we can kind of see the background. So it might work if the background weren't quite so dark, if you used, if you set up in an area where the lighting wasn't quite so uneven. But this image does show background, so you can see the depth of field, and set it up so that even though you've come in closer, you can still see some of the background, so we could see the change in the depth of field, if that makes sense. And then finally, focal length of the lens. This image made with the focal length at 60 and this one at 133. So from normal to telephoto, it's difficult to see a change in the depth of field because, as with the sneakers, there isn't really depth in the frame, in what you're shooting. Only a matter of several inches, I think, from the foreground, the space bar here, and the background a little beyond the keyboard and back to these wires. So even though you have certainly changed the focal length of the lens, it's difficult to see a change in the depth of field. Okay, so as with the sneakers, I would choose a setting or set things up where you have more space going back in the frame so you can actually see the change in the depth of field. Okay. Okay, great job on these. Thank you, guys. I'll stop the recording here and then go on in the next recording to look at Lightroom for a little bit. Okay.